continues with Derek RASMUSSEN, who is a longtime policy advisor to various organizations, and listed here as a doctoral candidate at Simon Fraser in the Faculty of Education. I thought it was law, but we'll learn about that. And his, the title of his talk, very neutral title really, it's hard to imagine what we might say with this title. It's Indigenous Languages Don't Just Decline. Canada Tries to Kill Them. The remarkable case of Inuktitut resilience in the face of government suppression of rights and services in Nunavut. Derek.
Uncontroversial. That's the idea. Morning. The introduction was a bit in error. This doesn't continue the Inuit part of the morning. It introduces the Katunat part of the morning. I've been white most of my life. I'm going to speak about white people and what white people have done. I was fortunate in the early 2000s to be working at Nunavut during the 12 years I lived in Iqaluit. I, at the time, was asked to give a workshop, What Makes White People So Weird? And it's interesting that this isn't a department in universities that we study, how it is that we ended up doing the things we do. Especially in this context, the imperialism of the English language and how it's come to dominate in Canada in particular still continues to dominate and undermine a thriving language in Nunavut. During the process of creating legislation for Nunavut, the very first thing after Nunavut was created in 1999 was an attempt to create an Education Act. It was the first bill, so it was numbered Bill 1. And I was assigned as a policy advisor to work with the Inuit delegation on the drafting of that act. 5 years earlier, an Inuit leader from northern Quebec, Charlie Watt, had lent me some courage. And in speaking to the Inuk that I worked for at the time, the boss of an organization I was working with, he said, make sure you always have a white guy to carry your briefcase. They don't listen to us when we come in the room, but if you've got a white guy carrying your briefcase, they're going to listen to you. And later, in a series of negotiations, a group of elders I spoke to said, were speaking through a translator, an interpreter, and said, we're tired. We're tired of fighting with these government people. The reason we hired you is to fight for us. You should know how the white people think. And we want you to do some of this fighting. It's tiring for us to do it all the time. During those negotiations, we proposed at the time that the Nunavut Education Act could easily borrow Section 17 of the James Bay Agreement, which creates the Inuktitut school system under a constitutionally protected land claim. And we could actually borrow some of that language and use it In the Nunavut context, easy solution, already a precedent set by government. And the white officials in the room said no. There was one who was about 25 years old from Rockville named Brad. And from now on, I refer to all of these guys as the Brads. The Brads rotate in and out of Nunavut on average every 18 months. This is a statistic from PricewaterhouseCoopers. It's not an anecdote. It costs about $65 million to fly the Brads in and out every year. In terms of the jobs they replace in Nunavut, PricewaterhouseCoopers, working for Luki's organization, estimated back in 2006 that it's about $1 billion in lost wages every 10 years. There's no corporate memory between the Brads. One group comes in, they replace another, they keep on carrying on the Katunat ways. I've been involved in, I think, all 4 iterations of the Education Act. There was Bill 1 in 2000 to 2001, blocked by the Brads. And Bill 2000, in 2006, we went through another iteration, made around 90 suggestions and changes, all but 2 were rejected by the principally Katunat government. And then again, as Luki has mentioned, there was a Bill 37 3 years ago, which was going to roll back Inuktitut rights, and now Bill 25. Currently, I'm just a student at university studying these things, but I wonder, how come this keeps happening? How is it that these white administrators get to control these English administrators and prevent the long-term aspirations very clearly expressed with sophisticated thought and argument in the English language from Inuit. And so that's been a topic of my study, how it is that the English whites continue to do this. And probably, I have to say, one of the most powerful moments that pushed me to investigate this was 2006. In a room with a table like this, with 14 people around it, we were trying to negotiate the next iteration of the Education Act. And by the way, that's why this date of 2019 is kicked around. People forget corporate memory, but it's a 12-year school system. And we thought the bill would come into effect in 2007. So we added 12, and everybody was saying, well, if the right to Inuktitut is enforceable in 2007, you add 12, by 2019, we're going to be graduating Inuktitut-speaking people from Inuktitut schools in 2019. That's why that's in there. We wrote that, government took it away, said, well, we're not going to give a rolling right. In other words, every year it will advance, because we could get caught. You know, kindergarten would start 2008, 9, 10, right? And by the time you got to grade 5 years down the road, you should have caught the whole system if it wasn't working. Instead, the government took it away and made it something that was going to happen right at the end, all in one fell swoop. And we would get all their rights by 2019. That idea was a rewriting of the act done by Brad, who's still there. Different Brad. This one working for the minister at the time from Portugal, Coast, Newfoundland, which I should mention, by the way. At that time, in 2006, there were about 242 teachers from Newfoundland teaching in the school system, which is easily more than all the Inuit teachers that had gone through the school system and teaching in it at that time. People jokingly referred to it in the education system, and it's not a joke, as Newfoundland, because there were so many Newfoundlanders running the school system. But in that meeting in 2006, I was at the time working for ANTI, had invited 3 mayors to consult with us, 3 Inuit mayors, and give their advice on how the Education Act should be changed. And we had a lot of these kind of meetings. You folks have probably been to these, right? People sit, they talk, blah, blah, blah. It goes on for days at a time, right? And you fall into a pattern. In one of these, the mayor from Inuktitut just suddenly lifted up his coffee and said, you know, when I was 9, they took me off the beach. And I remember turning and watching, and there were only, I think we were 19, but there were 14 of us in the room. But I remember thinking, there's 9 white people in the room, 5 Inuit, 3 mayors, and I'm watching this happen. And he goes, yeah, the boat came up when I was playing. I was on the beach, and they took me. And my parents, nobody knew that they weren't watching. They didn't know I'd been taken. So they assumed I drowned. And they brought me back when I was 16, but I'd lost my language. And people didn't even remember me in the community. And it's with some shame I say that there was a pause and none of us said anything. And the white people didn't say anything. We didn't apologize for what our people had done or acknowledge this. There was a pause, and then we went on to the next article of the legislation we were dealing with. About 10 years later, I was sitting in a pickup truck in front of the grocery store, and an elder turned to me, turned off the truck. We were going to go in and get some groceries, and he said, you know, it's really hard to watch HBO and Netflix and these things, because there's these shows that cover not right, where a child gets taken, and it's the whole show, it's 2 hours, and it's how it totally destroys a community. And we watch how God did not write about this. Then he turns to me and goes, what happens when it happens to an entire town? All of the children are taken. You know, it's hard to watch HBO when you go in and get groceries. It's one of the the problems that makes white people weird is what Chinois Cloutier calls our rescuer obsession. We push people overboard, and then we run around with life preservers thinking we're heroes, pulling 1 or 2 out of the water afterward. This is Sheila's observation that she makes. She was one of the people who contributed to the Nunavut Educational Task Force Review in Northern Quebec. And she's right. It seems to me one of the things Western medical professionals obsess about is the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. And if we were addressing the harm we were doing, perhaps that would be more effective than thinking we have a role in rushing around rescuing people afterwards. Christmas is coming, and English people will be sharing their favorite story, which is Ebenezer Scrooge, written by Charles Dickens. What they probably won't be sharing is Charles Dickens' other major work, which is his descriptions of Inuit and the Inuit language. Franklin expedition was an expedition that was lost in the 1840s, as you know, at sea in Nunavut waters. There was a reward in the 1840s of 10,000 pounds for anyone who could tell what happened to that expedition. And here, let me segue into something, and I'll connect the 2 dots. Last month, on a stage, in a situation like this, the Quebec Inuktitut scholar Louis-Jacques Doré said this sentence: all police officers in Iqaluit are women. And then he said, can you repeat that? And he said, you know, the translators that we worked with last year in Iqaluit, they refused to repeat it. And he said, you know why? Because it's not true. They wouldn't say it in Inuktitut because it wasn't true. And he tried every which way and enticed them, but just pretend it's true. He said, no, it's not true. I'm not going to translate it for you. He said, what if, and he tried different ways, they wouldn't do it. He eventually said, if I invent a different town name, will you translate that for me? They said, oh yeah, if it's a fictitious town, we'll translate that for you. The point he was making was the importance in Inuit society, the accuracy of relaying information. Where this connects with the Franklin expedition at Dickens is that when those ships were actually ultimately found, they were found according to Inuit oral history, which was accurate. That's how they could be found. You could say the Erebus and the Terror, the two boats, can't be found in English. They couldn't be found in English for decades, over 100 years. But they could be found in Inuktitut. What the Inuit also reported was that they seemed to have found evidence of cannibalism amongst the Franklin sailors of each other. They reported this faithfully to a man named John Ray about 10 years after. This so outraged Dickens, this is what he wrote. The noble conduct and example of our gallant band should not be besmirched by the very loose and unreliable nature of Eskimo representations. So we must rely on the copious and elegant European language. Perhaps they were set upon and slain by Eskimo. He said, this is the vague babble of savages, and English outweighs them by the weight of the whole universe. That's quite heavy. Chatter of a gross handful of uncivilized people with the domesticity of blubber should not be trusted. That's Dickens' writing in 1854. You can see some of what Inuit have to deal with when they deal with English people. Those are my ancestors. And the question I have is, language loss is always phrased as, oh, this language is declining. StatsCan says the Inuit language is declining. What about not using the passive tense? What about if people are bringing about this decline? My people. And it's still going on. It's not an ancient thing, an ancient past. It's happening right now. Imagine for a moment that you go to Quebec and that 99% of the government speaks English and only 6% speak French. Imagine 75% of all the government managers in the Quebec government are English. Imagine that the average income in Quebec for French people is $22,000 a year, and the average income for an English person is $100,000 a year. You may have picked up on the fact that I'm actually giving you statistics for Nunavut. Imagine if Quebec was that way. Do you think our friend, the esteemed Mr. Gagnon, would be sitting here saying something like Bill C-91 is adequate for Quebec? It would be okay enough to fix that problem? If C-91 is so great, let's trade it. Let's replace the Official Language Act with C-91 and give the Official Language Act to Indigenous language speakers. There's been a document released this week by NTI, and the president showed it to you a few minutes ago. These things very, very rarely see the light of day. They're marked stamped secret, do not photocopy cabinet document. And but this is how Kadunat make decisions in secret about what they really think and how they're really going to run things. One of the things that's important is to put names to the people, to not use the passive tense in our sentences. If languages die, who tries to kill them? Who were the people around the desk table on the day this was initialed? Brian Mulroney, Finance Minister Nicole Wilson, Justice Minister Jim Campbell, Fisheries Minister John Crosby, Indian Affairs Minister Tom Sidden, Bill McKnight, a former Indian Affairs Minister, David Crombie, and the Deputy Minister advising him was Harry Swain. Many of our Haudenosaunee friends may remember Harry Swain. He was the one who was key and involved in making the headquarters decisions about sending Canadian Armed Forces to deal with address OPA. And he wrote a book about it, where he lauds himself for all the great things he did at that time when he got to play soldier. He also refers to that particular cabinet as the most highly informed cabinet on Indigenous issues ever to have been a cabinet in Canadian history. Well, that's the cabinet that made this decision to block Inuit language rights. What's the consequences of this? A fly-in, fly-out group of white people who hold 75% of the senior and middle management positions in government, the brads. And it helps maybe to have this picture in your mind. There is a majority elected Inuit leadership. So that's the head of the government. It's a public government like Ontario or Quebec, but the majority of the MLAs and the cabinet ministers are Inuit. And the majority of the body politic is Inuit. But the NAC, 75% of the middle and senior managers are short-term fly-in, fly-out Anglophones.
Brats?
The brats. And the NAC writes the briefing notes that says these are your options and excludes certain options. The next says, oh, this is the only way you can do it in Ontario, because that's the only thing they studied in political science class at Queen's University. And they're only 25 years old and they don't know any other way. And so they say this is the only way it can be done. So it directs which way the head can look. The decisions in Nunavut are being driven by this group, the Anglophones. And it's unfortunate, but it's also driven in large part because there's financial gain here. The money that goes to this group is the difference between why Iqaluit has the highest income, it has the most covenant, and the rest of the communities have a much lower income. In fact, except for the communities with high concentrations of white people, most of the communities, actually the median income is lower than the Northern Living Allowance. Now that's what they used to call hardship pay. It's the $20,000 to $30,000 a white person gets when they, on top of their salary, that for working in Nunavut. And that actually, if you look at it, the median income across most Nunavut communities is lower than that, the actual allowance that whites are getting just for going up there. I want to give a little bit of description because I think, I won't say the person, but in early 2018, I was called on the phone and all the informants I speak to, by the way, are Inuit. And this is a bit embarrassing to me. There aren't actually any Kalunat who leak information or tell what's going on, but Inuit frequently do. And an Inuk working in the government called and said, oh, there's a new education thing they're doing, new bill. This is early 2018. And they said, it's going to push back Inuktitut again. I said, well, the cabinet was just appointed. And the informant said, yeah, this was presented to them at the new cabinet. It was in their first meeting. They hadn't asked for it. They hadn't drafted it. It was given to them on the way in the door. So I looked and said, well, who drafts that stuff? And they said, oh, the Justice Department lawyers. You can go online and look up the department. There are 9 of them. There are no Inuit in that department. And they rotate in and out. They write the laws. So we did a bit of digging and we found some descriptions because nowadays with the internet, people like to brag about where they work, how exotic it is to be in Nunavut. Here's a description of one of the lawyers who's there still working in Nunavut. Iqaluit's like a large university campus. There's a club for everybody. I play board games with a group. There's another group I watch documentaries and eat pizza with. There's a swimming pool and a movie theater. I signed up for a 3-year stint 7 years ago. The North is part of Canada few people ever get to see. It's kind of like Hogwarts. They sort of put me in the corporate area. What I like about Nunavut is it was born on April 1st, 99. Of course, as an aside here, continuous archaeological evidence of occupation going back 4,000 years, but let's forget that. Nunavut was born on April 1st, 99. I started at my university in 99. So my adult life and the life of Nunavut are running parallel. We're still doing things for the first time in Nunavut. We adopted every act, everything from the Northwest Territories, but we needed a body of laws. So we're trying to figure out how to serve 25 communities, none connected to the other. It's so interesting to practice law there. We're modifying practices, incorporating Inuit values. On top of the work and comfort and beauty of the place, we're getting to do things unheard of in the South. At the tender age of 32, I'm president of X organization, which I wouldn't have got to in my 50s if I was working in the South. Another lawyer says, this is another interview, we're quite small. For the most part, this is our first 10 years of practice. We're young, and the North is our boot camp. It's the best boot camp a young lawyer can get because you get to write your own files. I found myself briefing cabinet. I remember walking into the meeting going, look what can happen in a year out of law school. Moving to Nunavut expands my skill set and horizons. Learning on the job is a big part of my 5 years here. The average tenure for a lawyer in the Nunavut government is 2 years, only 18 months in the Crown's office. A few of us of justice are hitting our 5-year mark, or what we call our anniversary. The reason the work is interesting, so I've stayed on, because there's a level of responsibility here I couldn't enjoy anywhere else in my career at such a young age. Nunavut's only been a territory for 16 years. I get a chance to build things here. I'm a guy who likes to build things, metaphorically speaking. And at the end of the month or the year, I can say, I built something here. These are the guys. Running the show. As you know, most of them are there for 2-year rotations. 65 million bucks the taxpayer pays to buy them up and down. And they don't have much awareness of the society they're landing amongst. There is a kind of almost an apartheid, if I can say. When I first moved there, you have more of that word, I remember being told about the curling club in Iqaluit, and it had a place where people could go. And one of the Inuit who told me about it actually said, called it the Kenya Club. And he said it was, where the whites hang out if you wanted to be part of that. It was amazing to me that this kind of thing went on unchallenged. And also that there hadn't developed any culture of resistance among the white population to this, or a critique of it. And it seems like this is we're still waiting for that. To get to the details of this a little bit, we've talked about the Mulroney cabinet and how they blocked rights, but it would be unfair to leave the Liberals out. So in the name of balance, where Mulroney blocked rights, Martin blocked resources. The Nunavut territory was kind of rushed into being, if you like, the administrative structure between 1996 and 1999. In that period, you may remember, it was the largest period of cutbacks by a finance minister in Canadian history. They laid off more civil servants than any other time. It wasn't a good time to try to build a new government or pay for one. And Paul Martin, as finance minister, was given a memo asking if they had left anything out in their planning. And it was actually the due diligence by the Northwest Territories finance deputy minister. Her name's Margaret Melbourne. We should also credit when people try to do the right thing. She said, this is an important thing. We have to pay for this. And Martin's senior advisor for Nunavut in the finance department wrote the memo back saying, at a later date, this ended up being the line Paul Martin used again in another meeting. It's important to note that these meetings saying at a later date were between the NWT and federal departments of finance. My records, from what I can find, there were no Inuit in the room when these decisions were made. This was a decision not to fund the Inuit language as the language of government, not to fund the Inuit language as the language of schools, hospitals, and justice systems. For this reason, it's the only jurisdiction you can go to in Canada where a majority population is, let's say in the justice system, you're policed, prosecuted, and imprisoned by a group that speaks an entirely different language. You can pull up on the web right now the RCMP detachments for Nunavut. They have a section, a little page called language. Just open it and look. Just listen, English, 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 English. That's the language. The health system's the same, school system's the same. I think it would be amiss, or I would be remiss if I didn't mention the reason, in part, I feel this is such an important thing for Katlanaat to pay attention to. One of my friends who's educated me the most on these matters happens to be here today, Tommy Akaluch. And in one of our first conversations, he took me to the offices of Nunavut Sivanixvu and made me sit down and watch a 3-minute video of John Magualek, father of Nunavut, in 1976 on Front Page Challenge, which is as close to we get as Canadian royalty at that time, back in the day on CBC TV. And the interviewers on that TV show are trying to guess the identity of John Magualek, and they're asking him questions. When they finally guess he's the main negotiator for the Nunavut, what would become the Nunavut territory, the Nunavut agreement, they ask him questions. Well, of course, what Tommy was pointing out to me is, notice what the questions are they ask. They ask, how much money do you want? And they don't ask it once. Watch the video. They ask like 5 times, 3 different. How much money do you want? And Johnny says, it's not about money. No, but you know, if it is about money, how much money do you want? Yeah, but this isn't about money. This is about our way of life. Okay, for your way of life, how much money do you want? And they said, well, the land's worth money. How much money do you want for the land? And he finally looks, and there's a pause in that point, and he says, the land is something inside you. You can't put a price on that. The process for Katlanaat that we usually miss out on living in Nunavut is we are unable to be aware of the fact that we're in a highly evolved, sophisticated civilization with a sophisticated philosophical system that's largely inaccessible and that we look down on because we're ignorant. And in our ignorance, we do a lot of harm to this system. The sophistication of Inuit knowledge is, as Luki said earlier, so intimately tied with Inuktitut that harming the language is not just harming a lexicon, vocabulary. It's harming an entire philosophical matrix. And we're not alert to that. It's harmful to us to do this. But we don't actually see how harmful it is to us that we're doing this. Part of what I wanted to say about the active sense here is that unless we actually take responsibility as white people and English people for what we're doing there, we can't actually, any of this discussion about reconcile has to be, we have to deal with the harm we're doing, have done, and in this case, we're continuing to do. So in the example of the mayor who told that story about being taken at 9, I can find numerous examples like that. What I can't find is the name of the guy driving the boat who took him. There's no accountability. I heard the word accountability 20 times last night. And it all seemed to be about accountability of spending envelope. But I don't see my people being held accountable for what we've done. And I hear these accounts from Inuit, but I never hear the other side. So I'll end on one example. People know that the disc system was used in the Arctic to name Inuit. You've probably seen some of that, the disc and numbered discs were given. You may not have heard, some know this, but some may not know, that the reason it was developed by A.J. McKinnon in Pangatun, the medical examiner in 1935, was because he couldn't pronounce Inuktitut. He couldn't pronounce Inuit names. He couldn't speak the language. He didn't want to. And so the easier way to manage a population was to create a numerical system. These are the kinds of things we have to acknowledge. These are my ancestors. These are my people. This is what we did. By saying that, we can say this is wrong. We shouldn't do this. If we're doing things like this now, we have to stop. And ensure that if we're going to draft a bill like C-91, it shouldn't be anything the French or English wouldn't want for their own rights. And it should be completely interchangeable. Same level of rights we've granted ourselves as very recent newcomers here. We should, of course, be ensuring that the people who've been here for thousands of years before have. It seems so kind of obvious that we shouldn't even be having to discuss it. But as many of you know, C-91 never got to that point. And until there's a large group of Anglophones and white people who stand up and call for it, it's likely it won't happen. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Terry. We will have a few moments for questions and comments. It will be horrible QQ if we didn't. So please come up. We're running a little bit late, but listen, this is important that we need to assimilate what Derek has told us. And of course, at the end, this direct critique of C-91 hangs in the air and commits us really to looking C-91 in the eye and calling it out for what it is. Because it's as far away from the equivalent justiciability and standard of language rights for official languages, particularly in minority settings, as you could get. And without seeing both in the same lens, one guaranteeing constitutionally entrenched rights for anyone speaking the language, even in a minority setting, and the other not guaranteeing any justiciable rights to people who are in a majority setting in their own damn homeland. We have to keep those both in our heads as we move forward. Okay, enough of it from me. Let's have comments and questions. There he is, Max Ireland again.
Hi, good afternoon. I was wondering how much of a role the doctrine of discovery has played in all these situations. We're not being recognized, addressed, or seen as human beings. That gives them an ultimate right to say and do exactly what you were just saying. So when we talk about equality, we're still way down here, and the others are going up and up and up through the resources that they're taking from our lands. And they don't want equality, because then that'll make them guilty. and they don't want the guilt. So how did that play to affect the situations that are continuously playing out?
Vinay Lal is a professor in the States, and he says it's interesting there are all these departments of underdevelopment studies in universities. He said, wouldn't you think the real problem the planet faces is overdevelopment? Don't we need departments of overdevelopment? Or he suggested we call them economic obesity departments. I once read in a book by Gabriel Colcolet called Main Currents in Modern American History. I think he's the only one who ever noted it. But between 1810 and 1920, 50 million people left Europe and came to South and North America, Australia, South Africa. Up until very recently, that's the largest movement of any species we know of. I'm speaking species.
Yeah.
Like if 50 million camels moved from one part of the world to another, there would be whole departments of universities studying it. If 50 million zebras, or whatever. But I'm not aware of anyone who studies the movement of 50 million as a study and says, what would be the possible harm? Because you would expect a major harm to result with the relocation of 50 million people over 110 years in one species. I don't think there is much there. In my opinion, a lot of the struggle non-Indigenous that Indigenous people have with non-Indigenous people is that non-Indigenous people aren't aware that being non-Indigenous is so aberrant and unusual and has never existed before in history. I mean, to be non-Indigenous is nuts. Yeah, and for thousands of years, civilizations have been Indigenous. And if we have civilizations in the future, it will be because they are Indigenous. This is a short-term experiment that can't, as we're seeing right now, it doesn't look like it has much life left in it. It's aberrant and unusual, largely fueled by fossil fuels and capitalism. That's what my mentors and elders up north have taught me in terms of Inuktitut studies. This is why Inuktitut are the way we are and the harm we're doing. As I was discussing this with, I think it was Pamela Palmer here a couple of years ago, we were talking about all those signs you see around the lakes in Ontario that say, be careful with what is it, that grass or something is an invasive species? And we said, yeah, why don't we look at the major invasive species that this continent has struggled and suffered under? I'm not aware of a department anywhere or any university that studies non-indigeneity or de-indigenous. How people, not just that we're non-indigenous, but that we actively try to de-indigenize people that are here. To me, it seems quite shocking, a shocking omission. Supposed scholars.
Because they're still relying on it in their major decisions regarding Indigenous people to say, well, you're not a Christian, so you're nothing. And yet Christianity has evolved within our societies up to a level that I think is leveling off and even deteriorating now because of all those promises. Oh, you become a Christian, you're going to do this. We'll have this, we're going to have this and this. But it hasn't been done. And so our language, our culture, our traditions have been pushed back. Now they're coming forward. Now they're scared because we haven't accepted and adopted the philosophy of the Christian thing being put into our minds and in our heads. Much like you say, the 9-year-old boy picked off the beach and gone. We used to have guys on our reserve drive around in vans. Oh, here, you want a pencil? You want a chocolate bar? Come to church. They take us. Our parents wouldn't know. And they just, you know, they kidnap us just to go to church. And that's why that philosophy was there. When you be a good Christian, be a good this, you're gonna get this, you're gonna get that. It never happened. And it's still not happening today. So I have nothing against Christianity. If people want to believe what they want to believe, sure, go ahead. But what has it done for you?
Thank you, and I'll try to keep my comments brief. I know that we're a little behind. I want to thank you for a lot of what you said. I found inspiration in that. I've been waiting for a long time for someone like you to say something like that. And I know that our ancestors have been waiting even longer. So thank you. But a comment that you made just toward the end triggered me, perhaps, when you said something about granting rights. And I want to suggest that we shouldn't be looking to anybody else to grant us rights that have existed in these lands since before anybody else got here. And I know you get that, you understand that. I come from treaty territory. And so I guess last evening I acknowledged that the last time we met, I questioned what authority do they even have to pass legislation about our languages. Under treaty, we did not agree that the settlers could make legislation to do anything about us. And so I think that's something we all need to keep in mind as we try to figure out what are we going to do about this language legislation. I'm not sure that there's any other place in the world where you would find one nation making legislation for another nation. And if we're going to remind ourselves, as Amos reminded us last night, that we are civilizations, we are nations. It's not for anybody else to make legislation about us.
Yes, other two more comments.
I had just a quick response to that. In the Carioca Declaration in 1992, in Brazil by Indigenous people, they actually, it shocked me to read it, but it was very helpful. They said, we're not making land claims to anything. This is our land. You come to us with a claim if you want, but this is our land. And this was said, actually, they're echoing the first ITC president, or one of the first, James Arvala, in 1976, when he presented the Inuit treaty proposal to Canada. And his opening sentence was, this is not a land claim. And he said, well, we're not claiming anything. This is ours. And he was repeating the words from John Waglalik, who said, how did you determine that we are Canadian citizens? We have never been defeated in war by you. We have never signed a treaty with you. You don't have the right to tell us what's going on. And that's John, the John A. I mentioned before. So yeah, this is exactly.
Lisa?
Okay. So I'm a math educator by profession, so I'm going to talk a little bit about math. And a lot of the things that you said really have been connecting to some things my colleagues and I have been talking about. My colleague, the social studies guy, last night did the math of the funding for the Indigenous Languages Act, $337 million over 7 years, works out to about $48 million a year. There's approximately 1 million Indigenous people in Canada, so everyone can have their $48 to revitalize their language each year. Paul Martin gets $6 million a year from our federal government to run an initiative to bring English language literacy to Indigenous schools. He only does a couple of schools a year, handful of schools a year, because there is a recognition that developing English language literacy is expensive and he needs to bring in all his experts to revitalize language. So I think there are a lot of mathematical arguments that we need to be making, particularly to non-Indigenous Canadians who complain about how much money goes to communities when the inequity is so obvious, and the Brads of the world, I've met many of them, get, the cost of flying them in. How many of those 998 substitute teachers could be trained in community-based teacher education programs in English with the money for one Brad? So I think that we need to make some really good mathematical arguments, because I think the power is in that data, and people, white people, will listen to the data, hopefully.
I want to add a quick math argument too. The French population in Nunavut currently gets 8,189 per capita dollars per year. The Inuk gets $186 to support their language. It's 44 times more money per francophone than per Inuk for language support. So and I don't think French is an endangered language in Canada. That said, they also add $15,400 to each French student in the French school to support programming. This is the federal government. Can you imagine any of you, to think of your own language populations, if you knew you had $15,400 for each child to support just their language in the school, what that would be like each year? That's what's going as a subsidy to each student in École Trois Soleils in Iqaluit. And I still have the capacity to be shocked by this stuff. So
I just wanted to say something quickly, because a lot of what you said resonated to me, and I'm also a white person, so participant observation in white culture for 44 years now. And in academia, there's a lot of, we don't have the brands, I call them WMWP, welcoming white people, and they're not young, they're actually old, and they have all the legitimacy of professors who have PhDs and speak with that expert authority. And I just wanted to share with you something that actually myself and a Huron-Wendat colleague who's a political philosopher are participating in. We received a call for papers, and these are like well-intentioned white people, right? And this is what they wrote: globalizing minority rights. The Globalizing Minority Rights Project aims to develop a cosmopolitan approach to the conceptualization, justification, and implementation of minority rights, and to test this theoretical framework on 3 case studies: minorities in the developing world, Indigenous peoples, and refugees. So I flipped out when I read it, and I said to my Huron-Wendat colleague, what do we do? And anyway, this is one of our 2 responses. We sent an abstract saying we'd like to participate. This essay aims to critically engage with diverse Indigenous political philosophies that seek to conceptualize, justify, and implement relationships of reciprocal responsibility, and to test these theoretical frameworks on white people in the developed world, but in particular on Western political philosophers. And that's sort of where we're at.
Awesome. Well, you may have created a new field of bradology. Critical bradology. Yes, Amos?
I just wanted to remind everyone as well, when I was at the University of Toronto last 3 years, I was teaching a course on truth and reconciliation. And then inevitably we get to talk about the harms formula with the settlement agreements with the survivors and how it was rolled out in 2006 as part of the agreement. It was a $5 billion purse out. But Brian, Harper put forward Lee's government to the survivors of residential schools. And when I got to that point to talk about the IAP, the independent assessment process that some of the survivors could have went through to lay claim to some of the funds for the damages, I guess. And then you can go online, you can see the harms formula and the legend for paying out those harms. So number 1, harm, if you went through that process, you could claim rape or sexual intercourse via vaginal, anal, or fellatio. And then you get points, I guess, for the number of times you could claim that. And then it was transferred to a legend of dollar figures, 20,000, 40,000, whatever. So then I asked my students, I said, I wonder how many Indigenous people were in their room when they created the harms formula. Right? What I was really appreciative of was those students understand that now. And I can say they were livid leaving my class that day. And I knew it was a reward for me because I knew they understood the material you were covering in that class. So I asked all of you to look, if as another example to add to our discussions this morning, just this is recent history. It's in our lifetime that this is still happening. So I thank you very much for your words, and thank you very much. No.
Thank you to all of our participants. Now, Priska is in the room, and